Hey everybody, today we're talking about the female man. Now, this was a recommendation by Samuel Delany. He sent me a list of books that I'll be reviewing in the future on this channel as well. So such Theodore Sturgeon, which I'm really looking forward to. This is by Johanna, Russ, a very transgressive feminist, they say, or radical feminist is a better terminology for it. Now, it's funny, I actually read this book when I was first looking up the most difficult books I can find, stuff like Ulysses. I couldn't even read Ulysses. So this is like pre-Ulysses and pension. Like I dabbled in it, but I couldn't get into it. And this book is not too bad. There are some barriers to entries, but as long as you can keep track of all four main protagonists, you should do fine with it. I did read some plot summaries for it and just read a few passages just to remind myself on some stuff. And if you can keep track of all four female characters, you should do pretty good in this book. It's if you want to have a Wikipedia page open, it has who all four characters are, because all the names start with a J. Janet, Janine, Joanne, and see, I'm already forgetting it. But this book, it's an important book. The reason for it, especially nowadays, in the sense, where oftentimes with the feminist movement, and that the statistics showing that people who call themselves feminists, even women, are decreasing, yet feminist ideals are still there. And, you know, in some criticisms you can have of the New Wave feminist movement, it's really easy for online and disingenuous online personalities say that feminism was a mistake, when in actuality it was very important and still is to some degrees, but especially back in the time period, you just don't realize how many things weren't afforded to women. There's a story with Gloria Steinman where if you'd wait inside of a hotel room, they would ask if she was a prostitute and ask her to leave. And that actually happened to my mom. So if you were just a woman standing in a business suit by yourself, people thought you were a prostitute. And for people who say feminism is a mistake, I think this is a great book to guide them in that direction, because it just has a beautiful snapshot of what women were expected of. Even though one of it was, the part that I'm talking about takes place in an alternate reality where the Great Depression never ended, it's still so pertinent to what the mindset was in the 70s, even the mindset even before that as well. Now, the summary of this book is that it takes place with Joanne, if I'm not mistaken. If I get something wrong, forgive me. She gets an interdimensional visitor from Janet and Janine, Janet being from Wild Away, which is like some almost lesbian utopia, where the whole population is women. They pair off, though they live like in an agrarian society, so there's a lot of agriculture, not a lot of technology, and just a lot of roles and pathways they take, so that they just live in harmony and they can just really embrace each other with love. It reminds me of like, was it the Cretes, where they in the army, like men would pair off with men to be lovers, so if their lover died in battle, they can fight even harder and they wouldn't have to go home. There's a really undertone of that kind of civilization behind it. Joanne's world, which is 1970s modern day America, and she meets Janine, and Janet is just meant, the person from all the way, it's just meant to be a conduit to show different ideologies of women, different ideologies of love and lesbianism, and she gets into a relationship with another character, Laura, who I believe has the great passage where with the quote of the title, "The Female Man," and it just kind of goes through that until the very end, but along the way you get a lot of great dissertations and great passages on feminism and how it affects people. Like again, with the female man portion, it's about talking about, it's with Laura, where being a businesswoman, she has to almost give up her femininity. She has to become more of a man than the other men. She has to become tougher, and only then when she becomes that version of the female man, that hermaphroditic form, but an ugly one in the sense that it was forced upon her. Only then can she be embraced by the other gender. It's much like, well, people like me who are biracial, and you tell people that you're biracial, they almost can't handle the fact that it's like you gotta be more Mexicans than the Mexicans and more Jewish than the Jews. You gotta prove yourself more so than the average person has to. You have to work your way up that corporate ladder. You have to be stronger. But even though that admission with her, like just by her using qualifiers, by kind of like pseudo apologizing, kind of laying it on easy throughout her dictation, shows that there's always that trait of femininity within her, and because of that, she's always going to be demonized to a degree. She can't necessarily forego her gender, which is really different from a lot of stuff that you see in fourth wave and I believe third wave feminism with stuff like Judith Butler, like I commented on this channel before. And gender identity is permeated on language and not biology. Laura kind of makes the point, it's like no matter what I do, I can't escape it, and these men will always demonize me for that. Now, the passage that really speaks the hardest to me in the book is probably Janini, if I'm saying that right, in that where she comes with Janet to a vacation with her family, and the marital expectations that are placed upon her are so stringent and so brutal. She's dating this guy Cal. She doesn't really love him. He's kind of a slub, and like it's kind of like, well, why did she leave him? Because the dating expectations of the time, you just can't be a single woman, and there's a lot of pressure by her family to get married. This is a heartbreaking scene where, after just getting lambasted by each family member there, her brother takes her to the side, really instills with her, you have to get married. And, you know, she's just so broken at that part, she just goes back to her family, and it's like, okay, jokingly, she goes like, okay, who should I marry? And the brother says, anybody. And just to show, like, it's less about her choice, it's less about even love, it's more about the expectations and the pressures just to get married because a single female isn't viable. And throughout a long time of human history, it wasn't. You know, one can say criticisms like, well, you know, she's part of a world where the Great Depression continues, so they need a man to have that financial security. But in a lot of ways, that still exists in a lot of countries, and that existed for all of America until recently, and all of civilization for a long period of time. It's when, even though it can be an overused term at times, people mention the patriarchy back then, and even though we have made major efforts to dilute it nowadays, you know, the wealth still stayed with the man, and it would go to the first son or something to that effect. Also, a lot of patriarchy people miss is that there was a lot of classism, so a lot of wealth would be to the lord of the land who would impregnate a lot of women. But that's beside the point. But just seeing that, regardless of what class they are, those expectations are still placed on the female, and so it's less about her as a daughter, her well-being as a daughter, and more of just get married so you can be secure in that sense. So less her individual well-being. Now that part really spoke to me, and I really felt like Johanna Russ does a beautiful job. It's the least sci-fi part in the book, but she does a beautiful job of outlining of just the internal feelings of Janine, and just not wanting to do it, and just how painful of a process it is, and how painful it is to have your whole family turn against you to make you do something that you don't want to do, but you have to just because you're a woman. And a part of me that I always pondered for a while with this book is, does Russ go into man-hating territory, or if not necessarily man-hating territory, the world is better without men? I guess that's still man-hating. But then that comes up with the fact with the fourth Janet who comes into play, in that she's an assassin. She shows him, like, hey, I connected all you guys throughout the dimensions. In our world, it's a war between men and women. Women are at the top right now, but we're brokering a peace deal with the main faction of the men. And, you know, this part I'm not going to say is necessarily man-hating, because this is just what I feel indicative of two warring factions. I mean, there's a little bit underlying tones and everything, but they were going to do it until she realizes that the men still think women are the lesser beings, and she assassinates the king. And then at the end of the book, she offers the other one, like, hey, let's take over your dominions as well, let's take over your earth. And Jean and Janet are both like, let's do this, all right, let's get rid of all men, or at least subjugate all men. Now, when I first read this, there was a part in the book that made me think, no, she's not going totally there. I think she's saying the dangers of feminism, in that if you go too extreme, you can get into that hateful side of it, because the character who lives in utopia, Janet, who's always portrayed as a big, stocky pacifist, cries when the man is killed. And at the end of the book, when they ask, like, do you want to do this with us? Do you want to join us? She says, no. And the assassin says, you know, your place doesn't have men, not because of a plague like you thought, but because my people, wiped out all the men there in a war. And Janet's like, I don't believe you. And so my first impression was that was almost like a warning. But kind of rereading it again, and, you know, I will admit, this is me not knowing Russ beyond this. I really need to read more of her theory and other works of her. But the second time around, when I read some of that stuff, it did come across as it would be better without men. But at the same time, why do that with Janet? Why have her cry? Why have her not accept them? Why have that stage of saying, it's like, it wasn't plague, we took you out, and her saying, I don't believe you? Is it Russ saying to some degree that in order to live in the utopia that we need to live in, the past has to be forgotten in some way, and it's almost like the Machiavellian idea, like we need to do this horrible thing to get to that point? Or was my original idea correct in that, no, this is a warning? Because Janet and Janine get emboldened at the end of the novel and feel a sense of power they didn't have before. However, if you look at the time period those characters are written in, it makes sense in that way as well. But how much are they affecting the same thing that the men of the novel did? Also, a part that kind of led me to think the latter half is that there's no real great depiction of men in this novel. Cal is an ineffectual lover who just kind of stumpy in there. Janina's brother is a giant asshole. There's not really a positive male role model in this book, but there's a lot of love and emphasis placed on lesbian relationships. So that's what kind of tilts me to the latter. If I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments, because again, I am going to explore more Russ. Chip recommended some other novels by her that I want to get into as well. I could be misinterpreting her theory in this point, and I'm absolutely willing to leave that open, but I want to explore a little bit more before I have a definite answer. But that's kind of my thought process from then to now. Tell me what you think about the ending, and is it quote-unquote man-hating? I wish I had a better word for that. Or is it a warning like I originally thought? But yeah, that's The Female Man by Johanna Russ, and I really recommend this novel. I think it is a great snapshot of the times and the reasons and the ideology of feminism, especially in the 1970s. It's really beautiful, it's really heart-wrenching, and it has some little cool sci-fi moments in it as well. You don't get the hermaphroditic form of a female man, unfortunately, or much delving into that, but it's still a great novel in terms of femininity and exploring the different permutations of that as well. So, Female Man, check it out.
Next and final stop, Oceanside Transit Centre.
There's this heartbreaking scene where after getting pounded and pounded, just, whoa,